My name's Ann Huizinga. I am a community planner with Urban Systems, and we are hosting this event tonight. And I cannot tell you how excited we are to have 4 members of RISE joining us tonight for the presentation. For those of you who don't know, RISE is Reconciliation in Solidarity Edmonton, and they're a group that was formed after the Truth and Reconciliation. So the way tonight's going to work is Miranda's going to give a little bit of an overview. She's one of the co-founders of RISE. And then we're actually going to go through with each of the panelists a question. We're going to have 10 minutes per question that they've kind of gone through on the slides. And then we're also going to have some just time for really important discussions.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It's always interesting to have a new gathering of people interested in hearing more about this topic and hear the questions and the responses and the comments that come out when we're talking about reconciliation. Before we get into the discussion about how we all got involved with RISE and what brings us to the cause of reconciliation, I wanted to share a little bit of information about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Some of you may have heard of it before or have some questions, and so hopefully this will bring us to a place where we're all coming from a common understanding. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was actually the result of the largest class action suit ever filed in Canadian history. In the late 1980s, survivors of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School in Nova Scotia started forming legal action against the federal government and the church that ran the school for the abuses and the situation that they suffered. That led to other class action being filed across Canada that eventually became a national class action suit, which resulted in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that was signed in 2006. From that, the federal government settled out of court and agreed to a financial compensation package for survivors of residential school. Out of that, the survivors said, we want an opportunity to still give our testimony to the public because we won't have an opportunity to do that in court. And so out of that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. That meant that the survivors actually said, out of the financial package that you're giving us, we want a portion of it to go to the testimony and the opportunity for the public to learn about our experience. So I always think about those dollars that funded the TRC actually came out of the pocket of survivors. They could have taken that money and walked away, but they thought this is the most important thing that we can do for Canadians is help them understand what we went through. Through the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they held 7 national events, with the final one in Edmonton in March of 2014. At a national event was an opportunity for survivors to give their testimony to the public, to other former students of the residential schools, intergenerational survivors, as well as the churches and government employees that operated the schools. It was also an opportunity for survivors to for members of the public to bear witness to the survivor stories and hear what happened. A lot of times for Canadians, this is the first time they heard about residential school, and so it was an awakening, I think, for our country. In December of 2015, the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to an end, and now the work is left for us as Canadians to do. Throughout the work of the Commission, their job was to continue to share the stories and the information they were learning through the documents they collected from church and government archives, as well as the testimony and stories that they got from survivors and former employees from the churches. That resulted in a few different documents. The first one produced in 2012, which was the interim report that shared what they had learned up to that point, and also included a document called They Came for the Children, which was the first time there was a documented testimony and account for Canadians to learn from. On June 2nd, 2015, just over a year ago last week, they released the executive summary of their final report and the 94 calls to action. The executive summary was the first real glimpse that Canadians had into the full work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and an opportunity to really learn the information that they collected through their mandate. The executive summary, when it came out, is 388 pages long. And people say, wow, that was the executive summary. What's the full report look like? While the full report is almost 3,800 pages long, 2.3 million words, 7 books, 6 volumes that document the full history. This includes the different aspects of residential school, positive and negative, how they came to be, the history of it, as well as the testimony and experience from firsthand accounts. December 15th, 2015, the full report was released. All these documents are available online for free. I feel like this is an opportunity for Canadians to have access to this information. If you never learned this in school and didn't know this history, ignorance can't be pleaded anymore. This information is available for everyone to learn and understand. The 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission cover every portion of Canadian society. It's education systems, it's the legal system, it's the justice system, it's how teachers are trained, how government employees are trained, it's how the business community works with Indigenous people. Every part of Canadian society is affected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In November, I had an opportunity to sit in circle with one of the commissioners, Chief Wilton Littlechild. And he made a point to me that's kind of stuck with me since then. If you see news reports about the TRC recommendations, they're not recommendations, they're calls to action. And he made it very clear that we called them calls to action because a recommendation is a suggestion. You can take or leave someone's suggestion. A call to action requires a response. So I hope Canadians' response to the 94 calls to action is a resounding yes. If for no other reason, I think every Canadian should read the 94 calls to action, 20-page document, because our federal government has committed to implement all 94 calls to action. If the only reason you read it is for a financial reason, it's your tax dollars paying for it. So you should know what your tax dollars have been committed to. As I mentioned, in 2014, Edmonton played host to the 7th and final national event. It ended up being the largest national event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because this was the last opportunity survivors had to give their testimony to the TRC to be included in the final report. Our mayor, Don Iveson, served as an honorary witness. He was asked to be an honorary witness because different people in different communities were asked to be witnesses to the testimony so that they could use the information in how they carry out their own work. As a citizen of Edmonton, I feel like our mayor has stepped up to that cause, and I think that his time at the TRC has actually influenced a lot of the decisions he's made. He really reflected on his role as a parent and having 2 little kids at home and imagining what it would be to have the government knock on your door one day and take your kids away. As an intergenerational survivor myself, it was also an opportunity for me to give my testimony to the TRC and share the experience, my dad's experience, through my experience having him as a parent and what that's meant for my life and my decisions and my value system. The mayor also committed to a year of reconciliation in Edmonton that resulted in 3 different initiatives being planned by the city. An Aboriginal Youth Leadership Initiative, an education program for all city employees, as well as a commemoration to honor the TRC event that was held in Edmonton. These 3 commitments were made before the calls to action were released, and out of the 93, these are 3 of them. So the city of Edmonton's already committed to 3 of the 94 calls to action before it was even asked of them. So the 94 calls to action, as I mentioned, are a requirement and a response from all Canadians. It's not only going down the list and committing to the actions that some of us don't have control over. We can't necessarily say we're going to change the justice system, or we're going to change the curriculum, or we're going to affect change in the legal system, but we can think about the interactions that we have on a daily basis. Reconciliation is about a culture shift. It's about thinking about the relationships we have and how we interact and speak with one another. All of us can make that commitment by thinking about it every time we have an interaction and how we speak about this part of our history, how we speak about Indigenous people, and how we commit to, on a daily basis, making this a better place and a better community for all people. Before we get into the discussion, I just want to leave you with a quote from the executive summary, Honoring the Truth, Reconciling for the Future. The way we govern ourselves must change. Laws must change. Policies and programs must change. The way we educate our children and ourselves must change. The way we do business must change. Thinking must change. The way we talk to and about each other must change. Up here we have 4 members, founding members of RISE, and we're going to talk a little bit about reconciliation and what it means to us on an individual basis. So my question to my panelists to get us started is, what brings you to the cause of reconciliation?
Brings me to the cause of reconciliation. I was working downtown 2 years ago, and just around this time, and I knew the TRC was happening at Shaw Conference Center, but I didn't really know much about it. I actually thought, well, that's, it's an Aboriginal event of some type. It really doesn't have anything to do with me, so, it's interesting, and maybe I should look it up, but I wasn't really pulled towards it. I didn't do much about it until it actually was happening, and I'm not a particularly kind of energy-focused person, I don't think, but I really could feel that something was happening downtown. There was an emotional energy in my mind that was coming from the Shaw. And so I was driven to, I went to a noon hour event at CBC, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I got super emotional, shockingly to me. It's really surprised me. It took over, and I decided that I really needed to find out more about it. So I started doing some reading, and I think just became more open to the information, and a definite shift in perspective about Canada and the history of Canada. And so that's kind of what started it off. I would say that overall, what draws me to reconciliation is an ultimate sense of fairness. I think personally I'm kind of a rules-oriented person, but it's only recently occurred to me that the rules may not be fair. So that's been a really big shift for me, and not a fairness from a rules perspective, but a fairness from a human rights perspective. I think it's on me to learn more and be part of the change. So that's what brings me to reconciliation.
Hi, I'm Anna Marie Sewell. I like to fiddle with microphone stands. Truly, I do. In my other life, I work as a poet and multidisciplinary artist, and that is also what brings me to reconciliation. I'm an intergenerational survivor. My father went to day schools, not to residential schools, by simple luck of the draw, I suppose you could say. His reserve is an urban reserve. Sault Ste. Marie is in the middle, and you have Garden River and Botswana on both sides of that. So he went to day schools, and that has been, as Miranda said, a very impactful legacy, you could say, to understand as I grow up, as I grow older, what it was that he went through, because he wasn't a person to talk about it. And he passed away 31 years ago this month, so I was very young and didn't really have the opportunity to find out those stories from him. A lot of the people who could tell me the stories passed away young as well, and I don't take lightly, therefore, any chance I have to learn from people who have taught me about what that experience was for my family and for my more distant relatives. That's what brings me to reconciliation, is the opportunity to learn more of the truth about what our family have done, how we have survived. I've always been impressed by how much we survive, but boy, the more you know, the more you think to yourself, people are resilient, and it's a damn good thing we are.
I didn't really have much experience with the idea of reconciliation. I'd kind of heard a few things about residential schools, but it wasn't something that I was taught in school, and certainly none of my friends talked about it, nor my family. So I went, and as I was listening, I left there feeling, yeah, like Jane said, this energy, and I just couldn't get it out of my mind, but really feeling quite hopeless, I guess. The magnitude, once you start learning, it's like you just learn more and more and more, and the magnitude of the residential schools, the legacy it's left, is heartbreaking. So I kind of felt hopeless. And then through my work with Miranda on some other stuff, we just got to know each other more and started talking. And that's when she invited me to, a year later, watch the testimony that she gave as an intergenerational survivor of residential schools. And so we sat around her living room and watched the video, and then I think that's when it became really personal for me. At that point, it was like, this is one of my really good friends, and I just, even if I have to stand on the street and hold up a sign, I'll do it. Like, we have to do something. So I think that's really where it started for me. Yeah, and I wanted to just include this. This is a quote from Justice Murray Sinclair, and this has always stuck with me right from the get-go. He said, "I really don't care if you feel responsible for the past. The real question is, do you feel a sense of responsibility for the future? Because that's what this is all about." And so I just keep moving forward with that in my head.
For me, the idea of reconciliation started with grade 11 social studies. I happened to have a social studies teacher who was Japanese, and though it wasn't covered in the curriculum, he talked about the Japanese internment camps that happened in World War II and how his family was affected by it, and how his parents were children when that happened. And he made an off-the-cuff comment in social studies class that said, you know, this is the second worst thing the Canadian government did. So my question to him was, well, what was the first? And he goes, well, residential schools, of course. I'd never heard of it before. It wasn't a topic that was covered in our social studies class. So I talked to him after class about it and started to read, and all of a sudden light bulbs started to go off and make sense for me. Now I understand why, although my dad's first language was Cree, he never spoke a word to us. I now understand why he struggles with alcohol abuse and mental health issues. I now understand why we have nothing to do with his family or the culture, even though he obviously looks Cree, and it's obviously part of our heritage. It was after I finished high school that I started to self-identify as being Cree and connecting with the culture, and I can say the feeling that I had up until that point is almost like a child who has been adopted. You're transplanted into a family that you're told is your own, and fulfills your basic needs, but there's a piece in your heart that's missing. And it wasn't until I started connecting with elders and learning more about my culture and connecting with this history that I had been denied up to that point that my heart started to be filled. And there's hundreds of thousands of intergenerational survivors like me across Canada that have been denied that. And the resiliency that Anna Marie talks about, I'm so glad that portions of it remain, even though the Canadian government and the settler colonial history of our country did everything they could to take that away. There's grains of it still left that were passed on to me, and I'm grateful for that.
My question for and for me, for the panelists, is how has the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation changed your perspective?
It's done a lot for me to make me feel relieved. Really relieved. My father left school at the age of 12 and went into a winter camp with an elder in the bush. And when they came to take him back, the elder said, no, he stays. This man works for me now, and he's a man, and you leave him alone. My dad never told me that story. He told that story to my brothers. The story he told me was about how when he went to the Catholic school, they would always tell him, oh, you don't think we're bad, those Protestants, they're the really evil people. Then he went to the Protestant school and they said, no, you think we're bad, those Catholics are the really evil people. And he went, so I learned how people lie. We always grew up knowing who we were. And I'm so infinitely grateful for that, because I grew up in a time when a lot of people were French, when a lot of people were hiding because they had to. And when my mom brought back an Indian to Northern Alberta who didn't come from Northern Alberta, people said, you could just say he's French. It would be easier for the children. I am everlastingly grateful that both my parents reared up and said, in what way would that be easier? You got a problem, that's your problem. So we grew up with that knowledge. And I'm so grateful for that. What we grew up without was a community of support. And like Miranda's story, I didn't quite understand why we didn't go back to the reserve. We didn't have anything to do with those cousins over there. Not that we were told to hate them. We just stayed away from there. My dad was very plain about, he said, growing up on that reserve, that was a place to die. Okay? They told me when I was a teenager, you want to live? Get out of here. Go out into the world or you're going to die. So I had this very strong sense of it as a place full of people who were doomed. And without the truth about what caused that really strong feeling of you have to get the hell out of here or you're going to die, I would have never had the feeling I have now of relief that, okay, I can understand. I can understand my cousins, I can understand my lost relatives, I can understand my dad, I can understand so much more because I see that what he was talking about was not some strange little story, but just a tiny thread, a huge story. And one that the more you know about it, the more rich it becomes. It's a terrible story. The truth part of it is a terrible story. I've been honored, not in the TRC events, but just in my general life, to sit with people who have told me their stories of residential schools, who've told me of being raped, of being beaten, of watching while their girlfriend was raped and there was nothing they could do about it, of being force-fed salt till they nearly died. Just things, you know, the kind of stories that came out in the TRC as well. And you don't hear those stories and walk away unmarked. But before the TRC, I didn't have the sense of this powerful, cohesive narrative that we can then get to grips with. Now I feel the truth has set me free to say to you, hey, do you know about this? And not in some kind of knock on your door Jehovah's Witness kind of way, but if it comes up, to say, I feel like I can talk to you about it. Whoever you are, I feel like I can talk to you about it now. I don't have to just carry that and only talk about it with people who might have the countersign, the secret knowledge, the family experience themselves. It becomes all our family experience, and that's so important.
Once you start learning a little bit grows into a lot, and you start realizing the true magnitude of the legacy. I think the astonishing part of it for me was just how much it permeates into everyday life. That, you know, this affects our social and judicial and governance systems. I've got some stats here, but like, I mean, the last residential school closed in 1996. That, you know, I remember 1996. I was still in high school. Just kidding. But, you know, like estimates of 150,000 kids taken from their family, and 6,000 of those died while they were at residential schools, and some of their parents never ever found out what happened to their kids. And that, like Anna Marie said, you can't walk away from that. So I think that probably has changed for me, learning about it since the TRC, and then just having someone personal in your life that's been affected by it. And I think the biggest thing too, the truth part of it is, for me, that this isn't an Indigenous people's issue. This is a Canadian issue. This is all of our responsibility to do something about this, to make sure it doesn't happen again.
So the truth part for me was this realization that residential schools and the experience and the intergenerational effects that it's had was no longer this dirty little secret that Indigenous people had to share amongst themselves. It now became the responsibility and the burden of every Canadian. And every time I have an opportunity to share even a portion of my story or talk to people about residential school, I feel like a weight is lifted off my shoulders. I feel like the burden is now being carried by everyone in this room, and it doesn't weigh me down anymore. And so the truth portion to me is that the more people learn and understand the truth, the more people are called to act to make it different for the future. And when I gave my testimony to the TRC, I was gifted this tobacco pouch and this rock, and I carry it in my left hand every time I have an opportunity to share my truth. And it gives me strength, and it reminds me that at the time that the settlement agreement was signed, there was an estimated 86,000 survivors living in Canada. Only about 7,000 of them chose to share their story with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I have an obligation as one of those people to continue to tell my story for the people that aren't ready to or haven't got a chance to. So thanks.
For me, one of my favorite quotes from Justice Murray Sinclair is, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." And that's definitely been my experience the more that I've learned and taken in about the legacy of residential schools and the history of residential schools. This was my question that I came up with, that I wanted to hear everybody's answer to, and also give my own answer to, because honestly, it's changed the way that I see Canada fundamentally. And the privilege and the life that I enjoy rests on the back of genocide. And that is, I mean, it's doom and gloom, but that's how it is. It's changed my view of my country. That being said, though, I feel like there's so much opportunity to do better and to do things differently. And sometimes I have friends that challenge me about this stuff and like, what are you posting on Facebook all the time about the TRC for? What is that all about? And we have really interesting discussions. And I'm really happy that the Truth allows me to have those conversations in an open and generous way. I mean, in my mind, there really is no argument. This happened, there's a legacy, we need to deal with it. So the Truth has allowed me to have those conversations and share the truth with others, being open to it. So that kind of then leads me to my next favorite quote, which is, "We are all treaty people." I am definitely guilty of thinking that this is an Indigenous issue, or has been an Indigenous issue. And having that feeling of, I feel a bit sorry for Aboriginal people and Indigenous people, and isn't that too bad that they struggle so much? And it's been such a life-changing experience to move into actually being really, and I want to swear, but I'm not going to, like really impressed with the resiliency of Indigenous people, and they are still here, and their culture is still here, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. There's lots of struggles, but they are still here, and they're still rocking it. And if we as settlers can join with them and rock it together, I think the Canada that we can create is the one that a lot of us think exists already. I think we can get there, but we need to do it together.
What changes have you seen in Edmonton since the TRC and its 94 calls to action?
For me, the change happened immediately when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held its national event in Edmonton. It was the first time that I heard non-Indigenous people talk about residential school. It was the first time I saw it on the news. It was the first time it was on the front of the journal. It was the first time that the voices of Indigenous people were actively listened to and respected. And that continues in our city. I think that it's given us a gift to call on settlers to spend more time listening than talking. And I see that happening. I see more Indigenous cultural events happening in our city. I see allies being made at all levels of government. I see organizations making important decisions to include Indigenous voices in their decision-making processes. And only good can come of that. We have a lot of history to make up for, but it can be done on a daily basis with intentional actions like that.
I have to say that since the TRC in Edmonton, I've been quite tired. Really, the truth sets you free and it pisses you off, and there's a point where you go, I'll swear, I don't fucking want to hear about this any fucking more. Enough already. I want to plant my garden. I want to sing my songs. I want to go to the hardware store and get paint stripper and make this wooden thing beautiful. I want to hang out in the river in my canoe with good friends. I want to write poetry and not have everybody think, are you going to address the issue today? So I felt like these guys, like it's been a long road, and I'm going, whew. And I'm young. I mean, I'm old in my family's terms because I'm 50, but I'm young because I'm only 50. I'm like half the way there. I just want to share one little story, and it's not in Edmonton. It's I went to the East Coast to Mi'kma'ki, to my traditional territory, in September of last year. And I was invited there by a professor at UPEI, and because if you're traveling that long way, you kind of have to spread it out. So it became a 3-campus tour. And so I was thinking of Gilligan the whole time. It was a 3-campus tour. But the first stop, I had no idea what I was in for, was at Acadia University. And this is a change that is wrought by the TRC, that Acadia University now has an arts Mawiomi. Mawiomi is a Mi'kmaq word that means a gathering. So it also means a sacred fire. And there are, in our tradition, I've learned since, there are 7 sacred fires that make up our confederacy, but I won't get into that. The point would be there was a sacred fire right square dab in the middle of the Harriet Irving Formal Garden in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. And I arrived in the evening and was taken directly to the fire and introduced to Mi'kmaq elders, some of them from Shubenacadie, some of them part of that suit that got it all rolling, all of them with an incredible gentleness, benevolence, and just hardcore wisdom, because you have to have hardcore wisdom to get old. You have to be really tough to get old. As my mom always says, getting old's not for cowards. But the amount of finagling they had to do to get a fire in the middle of the formal lawns was remarkable. How remarkable I didn't know till the 4th day, when the head of all the grounds came out to the fire. And he ended up sitting beside me, this lovely Caucasian Canadian fellow, and he was so nervous. He was just so nervous about this fire in the middle of his lawn. And he had given the permission, but he was so nervous about it because it symbolized so much to give to the Indians the opportunity to use this land in that way. When he was so clearly, and he talked about it somewhat, so clearly used to, this is how we do it. This is the Harriet Irving Formal Garden. The Irving family paid for this. It's our university, and we're going to let them do this. What if they burn the whole thing down? They might go savage on us. By the time he left the fire, he was so mellow. He had just relaxed so much. And I was left with the thought that could not have happened before the TRC. That would not have happened before the TRC. That happened directly because of the TRC. And all night long, students volunteered to keep that fire for 5 days, 4 nights, right? It burned, and on the 5th day we put it all out. But students took it in shifts to sit with that fire, and the elders took it in shifts to instruct them for as long as people came to the fire. People came to the fire from all over that town. People came who had nothing to do with the Mawiomi. They just saw the fire. They wanted to be there. I got to hear some incredible stories from people from Mi'kma'ki, from people from across Canada, from people from Hong Kong, from people just coming to a fire. And that's a big change, that we look at our places of higher learning and go, the higher learning that's missing is the knowledge of what Mawiomi means, is the knowledge of what it means to light a sacred fire and to tend that sucker personally, in person, by hand, for 4 days, to commit to making sure you don't burn down the formal lawn, but you make space enough for whoever comes. And that's huge.
That was a great story. I don't have a story, and I'm not sure I really have an excellent answer for this question, because going back to my previous answers, I just feel like my perspective was so radically shifted around the TRC that I'm not really sure. I think I notice it more, so I don't have a baseline, really. I feel like people talk about residential school more. I feel like people are talking about the TRC more. But again, I don't know if it's just because I'm noticing it more. Functional things, I really appreciate the mayor recognizing Treaty 6 territory in most public venues. I think that's a great thing, and maybe a tweak for people to learn more or think about the fact that we are on traditional Treaty 6 territory. I just think there's a lot of other changes that we need to make. So I appreciate Miranda's perspective, that it's positive, and she's in a lot of circles where she sees changes, and I think that's really great. I'm not in those circles, so I don't see those as much. I see the work that we have left to do more, I think, than the changes that have been made.
The fourth of our formal questions, then we get to the fun bit where we all talk together. And the question I have for the panelists and myself is, so how will we know when we get there? What does a reconciled Canada look like? What are we actually trying to do, and what does it look like when we get there?
I wrote down a few things here. This one was like the toughest question for me. I don't really know, and I don't even know if I should be answering that, but I guess a few things came to mind. I guess for sure when all the 94 calls to action have been addressed in Canada by our government, I think that would be, I guess somewhat to me, it would be a symbol of like we're coming to a close of this reconciliation process. I guess not that it's over, but yeah, that it's been implemented, and I think then big changes would start to show. But I also asked my kids this, and this was really interesting. So I talk to them often about residential schools and what I do with RISE. They're really interested in that. And so I was asking them this weekend to help me do my homework for this event. And so I wanted to interview them and ask them. And this really, I don't know why, it just really hit me, but I asked my son, how will you know when we've reconciled? What does Canada look like? When are we going to know when we've like finished the work of reconciliation? And he said, well, when everyone knows what happened and when they accept our apology. And that really just struck me, and I thought, okay, I'm good with that. That's a good enough answer for me. And yeah, I think just one more thing I wanted to say, and I keep quoting Justice Murray Sinclair, but he said, we've all been taught to believe in Aboriginal inferiority and European superiority, and that's wrong. So I think when that starts to shift, that's when it's going to be true equality or equity.
So I think I have sort of two main things that I would be looking for to know that we have reconciled. And there's a head piece and there's a heart piece. My answer is going to be short. So the head piece is that when some of those metrics come into alignment where Aboriginal people, Indigenous people aren't overrepresented in our prison system, their rates of suicide, tuberculosis, diabetes, all those health factors are the same as their representation in the overall population. Education levels are the same. So when we've got some functional similarity in numbers across the population, that would be an indication to me that reconciliation is working well. And then the heart part, I think for me, is just that I would feel proud of the country, feel proud of Canada. Those two things, I think, would help me or would mean we had reconciled, or that would be a reconciled Canada for me.
So reconciliation is thinking about changing with intent the way we act and live as Canadians. And so there's a few signals for me of that. One is that I mention residential school and everyone knows what I'm talking about. There's no question of it. Everyone understands the impact it had. Everyone understands and connects with what it means to be Canadian with that history. Two is that, and me and Jane were having this discussion on the weekend, is that Indigenous culture is normalized and practiced in our community. It's not on National Aboriginal Day. It's not on Treaty 6 Day. It's every day. And just like every cultural group practices their culture freely and intently and sees themselves in the makeup of our city, in our urban design, in the public art that exists, that Indigenous people are represented, and that's normal, and that's acceptable, and everyone understands that. You're seeing pictures up here of some of the projects that RISE has been involved in, and one of them that Anna Marie and I worked on closely is a project called Reconciling Edmonton, where we found some images. You'll see them, historical images from the signing of treaty to present day that show relationship building happening between Indigenous and settler people in Edmonton. And the second oldest picture we found was from 1905, and it was a gathering on White Avenue. In 1905, it was illegal under federal law for Indigenous people to gather in numbers of 12 or more. It was also against the law to drum or practice ceremony. And both of those things are happening in this picture. It was also illegal for white women to be in the presence of Indigenous men. That was happening in the picture as well. The name at the bottom of the picture was called Indian Dance. And we took these pictures to people and got their feedback. What do you think's happening? Who do you think these people are? What's the story behind this image? And we took the image of the White Avenue Indian dance to a grade 6 class. And every single kid in the class talked about, why is this called Indian dance? These are not Indian people. These are First Nations people. They're practicing their culture. Why would they call it Indian dance? And my mind was blown that in a generation, that word is out of the vocabulary. With intent and thoughtfulness, we can change the culture of Canada, but we have to be willing to, and we have to be intent on doing it. If we're passive about it, it won't change.
Yeah. So it's calls to action. And when I dream in the future what it looks like, one thing I see is that northern schools, which still exist and still are often residential in nature because of the way it is when you're in a small community, you're going to have to, if you survive your first school experience, you're going to have to come into a bigger community for more education. We still lose too many people in that transition. There's an inquiry going on in Thunder Bay right now. You know about that, right? For all the kids who are murdered. Why is that happening? Why are they coming in off the reserves and dying in such numbers? There's the tragedy at Attawapiskat where kids 6 years old are thinking that they have to kill themselves. Nobody loves them, who cares? And I saw somebody, I wish I'd remembered her name, post on Twitter, here's an address, send some letters to the kids in Attawapiskat, for God's sake, let them know that somebody cares. And it made me think it's as simple as that. For me, reconciliation is the vision of all these northern communities, all these northern schools being sistered with each other, being connected. We have the technology to do this. We have the capacity to do this. This is not an expensive thing to do, but this is a profoundly impactful thing to do. These schools are connected to each other, so the students can talk to each other, so the teachers can share what it is to work in these communities, so the parents can understand what other school communities go through, so that we don't have the kind of isolation, underfunding, and lack of oversight that created the problems with the residential school system to begin with. And those fundamental changes that we need to make can be done. We have the means to do that. And we have the means to partner inner cities with outer communities. I see the day when there will be a network that means that any kid anywhere will come into the larger communities as an Aboriginal kid and feel like they have a place, they know people, there's someone there to catch them. When I came to the city, my dad dropped dead and I had to get a job. Thank God my sister was there, and thank God I had my two best friends who were Chinese, and so we were the colored girls. By the time we got to our high school, we were the three colored girls in our little bug tussle. But they had moved here. I had people to catch me when I landed. When we're reconciled, there will be people to catch all the youth. And we're those people. We're those people. We're those people who can make a place where we want to learn as much about Attawapiskat as we do about Uganda. We want to learn as much about Nain, Labrador. And do you know they practice circus in Nain, Labrador? I work in the arts. I get to know this privileged information. There are touring circuses, for God's sake, European-style circuses that go up to Nain, Labrador and work with the people there, and they adapt it to be specific to that culture and that place. So it's something entirely new. And there's Arctic Cirque, which is a whole wonderful thing that incorporates Inuit culture and Cirque du Soleil culture. And a reconciled Canada means that we understand more and more as an artist what roots we have that rise out of this land, that are distinct, that are important, and that can inform what we do, so that when you say you're Canadian, it doesn't mean you drink a certain kind of mass-produced beer. It means you too inherit this great history that we all have and that has so much been lost but still survives.
I just want to say now, so one of the workshops that we do that we deliver is called the Blanket Exercise, and it's an interactive workshop that takes Canadians through our history from an Indigenous perspective. And at the end of our sharing circle, or at the end of the exercise, there's always an opportunity for people to share and reflect. And so I hope that you do that tonight. And we're always interested in the different people who show up to our events and are interested in this topic. And I think back to one sharing circle, there was this gentleman who, I'd say 40-ish, 300-ish pounds, tattooed up and down the arms. And when it came to his turn to speak in the sharing circle, I was like, okay, what's he going to have to say? And he talked about reconciliation being a bug, a mosquito that's been buzzing around. He's kind of heard it. Other people have been swatting it away. But tonight he was bitten. So I hope that tonight you've been bitten and that you need to scratch and you need to react to it. That's my hope.